My name is Michael Guyad, publisher of the Lead Lag Report. Joining us for the hour is Sergej Sumlenny, who's got quite a bit of experience and expertise when it comes to what's going on in Russia, in Ukraine, in geopolitics. So, Sergej, for those who are not familiar with your background, talk about who you are, where you grew up, how'd you get so interested in some of these geopolitical factors that we're seeing here, and what you're doing now.
Oh, thank you. First, thank you once again for having invited me. It's a pleasure to be in your spaces. Great fun. Thank you. Yeah, about myself, I was born in Soviet Union in this central Russia, like close to Moscow 40 years ago. And I was socialized in Russia after like a couple of years, after 2 decades of living in Russia and having been introduced to all sorts of like Russian socialization. I've moved to Germany feeling that I'm not so much happy with what is going in Russia. And since like 20 years, about like 20 years, I live in Germany. And I have abandoned my Russian citizenship, have been naturalized in Germany, and have never regretted this fact after I have been naturalized in Germany, because what was going on in Russia after I left, it has just confirmed my worst fears. And since 2015, I was working in Ukraine as a head of the director of German foundation, Heinrich Böll Foundation, which is close to German Green Party, which is one of the governing parties in German government now. So I spent in Kiev in Ukraine 6 years, from June 15 to September 21. So all the golden age between the Maidan revolution and the latter full scale invasion by Russian forces. In September 21, I returned to Berlin and continued to observe the situation in Ukraine. And I was feeling like Russian war is inevitable and they will attack Ukraine. So now I observe the situation in Ukraine very close. I work in Berlin as an independent political consultant with my focus on Ukraine, Russia, and Central Europe. And that's what I'm doing, and I'm happy to share my some ideas which are pretty simple and pretty transparent with you if you are interested. So thank you very much, and I'm very open to any questions. Thank you.
All right, so let's first talk about some of the things that you made you leave Russia. What is it that you saw growing up that concerned you? Because it's a pretty big decision to move from one country to another and essentially kind of denounce where you grew up. What is it that you saw that was problematic?
Oh, you're very right. You're very right. And it was not a very easy decision or a simple one. And it was not like a fast decision. It wasn't just like I woke up one day and said, let's move from Russia to Germany. I don't feel comfortable here anymore. Of course, like maybe if I were like a member of like some group which was discriminated in Russia very actively, and if it were like 2018 or 2016, when the discrimination was very open and clear, like against minorities, against homosexual people, against Ukrainians, maybe this had been my decision, but like, no, it was like in my case, I went to Germany in 2005, and it was, as I believed back then, it was like just a journey for 1 year. I wanted to finalize my PhD, and it was like a very like PhD on the history of media in Germany, and how media were important for the creation of German democratic state in Western Germany after World War II, like why media are important for democracy. And I went to Germany in 2005. And I was starting like to observe Russia from outside, and I need to say that observing the home country from the outside gives quite another perspective. And then came like pretty different situations. Like the war on Georgia came in 2008. In 2009, there came like a story which really shattered me. It was very personal because in 2009, my daughter was born in Berlin, and I was like a father with a newborn daughter. And the same year, Russians decided to instrumentalize Russian kids living abroad, and they have found one girl, of 5 years old girl, Alexandra, who was living back then in Portugal, and she was living at a foster family. And they have decided they need to demonstrate Russians how strong Russian society is in protecting the children against the bad Western society. So they have decided just to take this kid from the foster family and bring her back to Russia, to Russian province, to some like heavily alcoholized family. And it was broadcasted on Russian TV very proudly. They have even broadcasted how her biological mother or hit her at the airport and called her with all possible bad words. And that moment, I believe that I thought, gosh, if they broadcasted this like as a mother is hitting the 5 years old daughter in the airport and calling her with all like the slurs and bad words, if they broadcasted it on state TV as a huge victory of Russian diplomacy, oh my God, what has remained beyond the footage, beyond the broadcasted pictures? And then I started I started to think about my daughter, and I thought, gosh, if they destroyed the life of an innocent 5 years old girl who is not an opposition leader, who is not a journalist who criticized Vladimir Putin, who is not like a Ukrainian politician involved in gas conflict with Russia or a Georgian politician involved in war against Russia, a 5 years old girl who just lived in Portugal, far away from Russia, if they decided to destroy her life and proudly broadcasted it, I need to protect my kids. I need to protect my son and my daughter, and that was the final moment for me, as I told me, that's not my country anymore. I cannot associate myself anymore with a country which destroys a life of a 5 years old Russian girl. Yeah, that was that decision. And all everything what happened later after that just confirmed my worst fears.
Okay, so you mentioned you study the history of media in Germany. I think post war. Oftentimes, when you hear how a country handles the media, the first thing you think about is propaganda. And I'm sharing at the top of the space a thread that you put out on June 11th, which I found fascinating, which is a different form of media, but it's in the form of books, right? In terms of some of the messaging and some of the ways that maybe Russia was kind of prepping the culture and the society for what might be to come. I want you to talk through that thread a bit and how the Russia book market maybe was foretelling or warning that war was coming.
Yeah, thank you for having posted it, and I really recommend, not because it's my thread, like I just copy pasted the pictures. I recommend really everyone who is hearing these spaces to open this thread and to read through it. There are really brilliant books with astonishing covers. For example, my favorite one is picturing Adolf Hitler, the German dictator, wearing Russian airborne troops uniform and attacking Great Britain together with Russian troops, and that is on the cover of a science fiction book. Yeah, so in this thread about the Russian books, it is the thing that every person who lived in Russia knows very good, but out of some reasons, it is very like uncommon information in the West. Maybe because the books are really pulp books, like very bad quality, but published in some crazy numbers, both in numbers of titles and in numbers of how many books of every title have been published. So, to put the long story short, starting from somewhere 2010, Russia started to publish massively and with state support books claiming that Joseph Stalin and his tyranny was a very effective and good way of rule the state, and all the stories about like killings and torture and repressions are a Western lie. And some 2 years later, they have started to publish in crazy scale, like dozens, if not hundreds of titles, the books about fantasies of how Russia should rewrite the history. Like the standard plot of each and every of this book is that some guy from today's Russia wakes up in someone's body, like 100 years ago, 50 years ago, 300 years ago, and change the outcome of history. Like normally they win great wars, or they change the alliances, or they kill some foreign leader and let Russia win global wars. And then you can like say that you can see that it is really about the Russian national trauma, because Russian national trauma is that they believe that Russia has been betrayed by the West many times and deprived of the global leadership which Russia, as they believe, deserves. So in all these books, they, for example, they kill, I don't know, like Napoleon, they kill Elizabeth, Queen of England, they conquer the United States in a civil war, or they like turned the German Reich in World War II an ally of Russia, or they like my favorite book is when Russian guy awakes in the brain of Adolf Hitler and makes Adolf Hitler a long-time ally of Joseph Stalin. So not just for 2 years as it was in history, but forever. And together, Adolf Hitler, with the Russian guy in his brain, and Joseph Stalin forge an alliance, and they attack the British Empire, execute Winston Churchill, and win the world. So that was some sort of like nationwide paranoia and psychosis. And these books were everywhere. Like in every bookstore, you just could not enter a bookstore without having all these titles. And
And do you think it came from? I mean, that sounds like it was almost like an edict, like the whatever Russia government officials basically called up a bunch of publishers and said, "Focus on this." I mean, what caused that? Who was the driver of that?
well, I don't have, of course, the written papers when like Russian presidential administration writes the bookstores and say, okay, you need to sell that much books about like good Adolf Hitler and bad Winston Churchill. But just think about like how Russian economy works, and especially book sector. You really may not publish anything about sensitive topics like World War II without an approval in Kremlin. Like if you look at the current acting Russian legislation, you may not even mention the Hitler-Stalin Pact, Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, this military and political alliance of Nazi German Empire and Soviet Union in 1939 without being liable. Like you will be arrested because it's a crime in Russia. Currently, it's a crime to question the logic of Hitler-Stalin Pact and to mention it and to say that it was bad to forge an alliance with Nazis. Like you will be put into jail for any comparison of Russian or Soviet troops with the Nazis, because as it was in Navalny case, for example, they will just find some 90 years old war veteran who will sue you for insult, and you will, because like he felt somehow bad and his heart rate is increased after he read that the Soviet army has like committed war crimes, and he will be put into jail for that. So in this situation, when you really may not say anything about this topic, to publish books where on cover Adolf Hitler wears a Soviet uniform and attacks Britain, and you will not have any visit from FSB, from Russian secret police, or from prosecutor's office, or something like that. It is already 100% proof that all these books were like ordered from Kremlin directly. And it is very clear because they were preparing the war against Ukraine and against the West. Like a good half of these books were about the future war on Ukraine. Like the first books like that were published in 2007, 2009, and they were describing the war between Russian army and the US army and NATO on the territory of Ukraine. So that's how they prepared the first invasion in 2014. And after the invasion, they have just republished them. So I have absolutely no idea that this could be something else except of the Kremlin order.
It's fascinating to go through the thread because the imagery, it almost looks like it's a comic book. Like it's targeting a youth type of audience to maybe indoctrinate around these kind of fantasies, right? Around what if history played out differently and how it would have been better for Russia. To me, it's fascinating how the seeds get planted early on for conflict.
Well, of course, like we have in the West this kind of books like What If, and if you look
Right,
at,
right.
for example, at Amazon series, which I love very much, the Man in the High Castle, it is exactly this dystopian series about like what if Nazis have won. The difference between what we saw in Russia is that when we play in the West with what if we had lost, right? Like every book or TV series or something like that in the West with what if is about like some bad outcome for us. Like what if Nazis had won? What if like the Japanese have won? What if like we have like some bad things, and how the resistance fights against it, right? So in Russia, it's quite the opposite. In Russia, it is a psychopathic fantasy about how Russia should rule the world. Like you will never see any serious book in the US about like how the United States conquered the Soviet Union in 1950 in a conflict, right? And how the Pax Americana have spread like all over the world. You can like see books like about like Cuban crisis when like the Soviets strike the US and we have a nuclear war, or about I have no idea. Like even if the in Tom Clancy's books, like Tom Clancy always played with worst scenarios and the US always won at the end, but they have never like conquered the world. Like in Red Storm Rising, the Soviet army attacks in Europe and like push through the defensive lines, then the Americans win, but at the end like they shake hands, the American US American and Soviet commanders, and actually the outcome is the same as before the war. In these Russian books it's different. In Russian books it is about like as Russians they have this saying like to spreading salt over someone wounds. Like they really scratch their wounds about lost world wars and dream about how they conquer the whole world. And everyone is bad in these books except the Russians. Like the British are bad, the French are bad, the Americans are very bad, Germans are bad as well, Jews are bad, Ukrainians are bad, Poles are very bad, etc. Russians are safe. You will never find something like this in the Western books, like because Western books, even the most like fantastic ones, they are always like somehow differentiated. And here it's pure fantasy about conquering the world and how it should be done. It is something we experienced in Germany after World War One during the Nazis' rise. In Germany, they called it Dolchstoßlegende, the legend about being stabbed in the back. Because the core idea of the Nazis was that the German army, the Reichswehr in First World War, they were victorious, as Nazis said, but the communists and the Jews attacked them politically from the back and forced them to capitulate. And that is exactly what Russians are telling their kids, that the Soviet Union was prosperous and about to win the Cold War, but the liberals and the West and the CIA just like revolted and the victory was stolen. And now it's time to take back what is ours. That is what Nazis said. That's why they started the World War II. That is what Putin says, and that's why he attacked Ukraine and is about to attack NATO. Yeah, that is the crucial difference.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Let's get up some of the audience here. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Like, well, first I want to say that the most radical group, religious or right-wing group in Russia is Vladimir Putin and his friends. Like when you read his stories, and he loves to publish quasi historical articles, or you listen to his interviews, you will see like he's a nuclear psychopath. Like he said in his interview like 3 years ago, I believe, literally, in the case of a nuclear war, we Russians will die as martyrs and the West will just perish. Like his bureaucrats, like for example, his Minister for Culture, Medinsky, is a well-known author of dozens of books, which historical books, pseudo-historical books, with one single idea that the West, since centuries, leads a war against Russia and wants to destroy Russia like since centuries, and because Russia is morally superior to the West and like the stronghold of high moral values. Like that is actually a quintessence of any religious fundamentalism, right? The former vice prime minister of Russia and before Russian envoy to NATO, and now the director of Russian space agency, Dmitry Rogozin, is for years neo-Nazi activist. Like, and when I say neo-Nazi, then I really mean it, because like there are a lot of photos of Dmitry Rogozin posing with Hitler salute or holding speeches on the swastika banner. And this is the guy who is one of the top Russian bureaucrats since years. He was also Russian top negotiator with 6 states regarding the Kaliningrad status. He was Russian negotiator to the West on anti-missile defense. So he is really like the Russian top security, military, foreign policy guy, and he is an openly neo-Nazi having photos of himself under the swastika flag. So that are like the people around of Putin. And if you see the if you look at the wild right wing groups, you have also a lot of them. Like just remember, I think 3 years ago it was, or 4 years ago, there was a prime broadcasting of, or not broadcasting, like prime presentation of a new movie about the last Russian king, Nicholas II. I think it was German American production, and it was a film about the Nicholas II, Russian Tsar, as he was a Russian prince, or before he was crowned. And it is a historical fact that Nicholas II had a love story with some dancer from the royal ballet, which was pretty common back then. And the problem was that Nicholas II was proclaimed as a saint by Russian Orthodox Church. And imagine what? Russian Orthodox Christian like nationalists have car bombed the movie theater in, I believe, Ekaterinburg, where this movie should have been demonstrated. So just think about it. The guys have really put hundreds of kilos into a minivan and sent this minivan with explosives to the movie theater and have blown it up. Because in this movie theater there was a movie like demonstrated about a Russian prince having a love story with a ballet dancer, and they were insulted by that. Like, what country in the world can you imagine doing something like that? That is what was broadly ignored in the West. Neither it was the topic of how strong the far right, nationalistic, chauvinistic ideology is deep into the Putin's inner circle, nor how strong and violent Russian chauvinistic, nationalistic, neo-fascist groups are in the country, which are like not inside of the authorities, but are tolerated by these authorities. So yes, like it is very much spread. And these are the people who have been recruited for the war against Ukraine.
It's fascinating because the media and the book angle would suggest that Russia really is committed to this from a longer term perspective, right? That they really probably are not going to back down because they've been laying the groundwork for some time on that. What do you think the West gets wrong about this war with Ukraine? And are we to believe that Ukraine is going to be able to fight out of this? Is this going to be a long, protracted type of conflict? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that there are like two basic mistakes, like two ultimate mistakes, original mistakes in the perception of the West. The first one was that Ukraine is a corrupted, weak, failed state. It is not. It is neither corrupted, at least like to the level it is was believed, nor failed, nor like losing state. Ukrainian society is highly sophisticated, very horizontally developed society with a lot of political power, with a lot of knowledge and a lot of will to fight for democracy. Ukrainian corruption indeed exists, but as a German citizen whose ex-chancellor is working for Vladimir Putin, I'm not the one who should talk about Ukrainian corruption or allegedly Ukrainian corruption, right? And as a person who worked in both Russia and Ukraine, I need to say that I have not seen in Ukraine any corruption which would be stronger than the Russian one. And I believe that Ukraine, after all, is a less corrupt state as Russia. So the West was afraid to provide support to Ukraine because because we believed that it will not help, like Ukraine will fail. And I know that the Ukrainian ambassador to Berlin told them like within 24 hours after Russian attack, he was speaking to one of the ministers in the German government. And the minister told him that Germany would not support Ukraine because everything will be over within a couple of days and there is no sense of support. And that was a crucial mistake because we are currently in the 112th day, right, of the war, and Russians have reached no goal, zero goal out of theirs they have set for themselves. So that was the first initial mistake. The second mistake is that very many politicians in the West wrongly believe that Vladimir Putin is interested in some sort of a compromise, in some sort of a deal, that you can offer Vladimir Putin something what you may offer him still and what will make him happy and peaceful. And that is a very crucial mistake because Vladimir Putin is not a person who's interested in deals, at least in deals when he needs to accept some sort of compromise. He can accept a deal from you if this deal is a full capitulation. If you say, take my capital, my property, my political system, my people, and myself, that is the deal he will accept, but nothing less. So the whole story of Vladimir Putin's aggressions is that he says that he is interested in some sort of a deal, but in the fact he's never looking for a deal. He says that, okay, we feel insulted or threatened by the NATO, and we need like Russian language rights in Ukraine, and we need like some sort of peace guarantees, etc. But it's all bullshit, because the only thing he needs during these so-called negotiations is to have time for bringing his army to your border and to weaken you with unnecessary talks and political discussions instead of letting you pay for your army and discuss within your society how you will fight back. So every time Vladimir Putin was looking for so-called compromise, he was gathering an army. It was so in Georgia in 2008, it was so in Ukraine in 2014, 15, and later. It was exactly like that before the full-scale invasion in 2022. And it is now, because like, look what he's doing with the so-called blockade of Kaliningrad. Like, for those who are like not that deep into the current crisis, like Russia has an enclave, like part of its territory, which is completely surrounded by the EU. This territory is a former German territory from 1940s, which the Soviet Union has taken from Nazi Germany after World War II. And now, like, it's a tiny little piece of the land inside of the EU territory, bordering with Poland and Lithuania. And Russians has pumped it with weapons, including nuclear ones, since at least 2012, because like the distance to Berlin is just like 600 kilometers. And since a couple of days, Lithuania is blocking the transport of EU sanctioned goods from this region and to this region in accordance to the EU sanctions, but allows all other goods like food, medical equipment, and anything to go in and out. But Russians call it a blockade, which is not true, and demand a full resolve of this so-called blockade. So what does Russia want us to see here? They want us to see that bad Lithuania blockade, like innocent Russian piece of land, and this is active war. It is all for, and then Russia threatens with retaliation, of course. This is all not true because first, as I said, it's not blockade. Second, it's not Lithuania, it's European sanctions, which were caused by Russian aggression in Ukraine. And what is more important is that Russian aggressive actions against Lithuania are way longer than these Lithuanian steps. And when Russia now says they will attack Lithuania, actually they have prepared the attack a long time ago. More than a week ago, Russian parliament started to discuss the bill which actually denounce the recognition of Lithuanian independence. They literally discussed the bill on how they will stop to accept recognize Lithuania as independent state and will start to call it Russian Republic, the Soviet Republic of Lithuania. They do the same with other Baltic states, Estonia and Latvia. They want just to renounce the on recognition of their independence. And when now Vladimir Putin says that they will retaliate because of the blockade, no, they prepared this attack weeks and months and years before. And they just want us to believe that this attack is caused by some like stupid actions by Lithuanian government, exactly as they wanted us to believe that the attack on Ukraine was caused by some decision of Ukrainians to join NATO. But in the fact, they published books about how they will attack Ukraine since at least 2007.
Yeah, very, very interesting.
So, let me start with the nuclear part. I don't believe that Russians will use their nukes At least in the foreseen time in the next time. Why? Because nuclear blackmailing is a perfect thing against the West until you use the nukes, right? So it's wonderful to threaten with nukes, but it's terrible to use nukes. Hey, what happens when you nuke a city? Russians have already destroyed several Ukrainian cities. Mariupol, 500,000 people, looks as if it had been nuked. So what else? Okay, you can nuke Kharkiv, you can nuke Chernihiv, you can nuke Khmelnytsky, but what you will do after that? You cannot nuke every city in Ukraine. Yeah, that will not help. So I don't believe they will use nukes. Secondly, regarding the goals of Russia, well, the original goal of Russians was to destroy Ukraine as a country, as a nation, to capture Kiev, to force Zelensky to sign some sort of capitulation and to proclaim Ukraine as an obsolete state or to install their own government. This goal has not been achieved, and even the capturing of eastern part of Ukraine has not been achieved. Maybe they will manage to capture Donbass, but I'm not that much. It's exactly like it was in 2014, because in 2014 they wanted to cut Ukraine from the Black and Azov Sea to make the land corridor to Moldova, which they have not succeeded to do, and they have just abandoned the plan for the next years. They try to redo it now, but they have still failed to capture Nikolaev and Odessa. Or Mykolaiv, correct in Ukrainian, and Odessa. So they have not managed to do it today, but it also doesn't mean anything because Vladimir Putin is a totalitarian leader who controls his media. He can say that he can have any goals. During the last 3 months, they have changed the official goals many times. The first official goal they have proclaimed is so-called denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine. Very unclear goals. Nobody can prove if they have been fulfilled or not. Then they said prevention of Ukrainian attack on Russia, and as Ukraine has not been preparing a military attack on Russia, they can say every time, okay, we have prevented it, so the goal is fulfilled. Now they can say everything. They can say we need to capture Severodonetsk, and that's our goal, or we need to keep Kherson under our control, that's a goal, or we want to protect people in Crimea, that's our goal. So they can tell really anything, and they can claim via the media that the goals have been fulfilled, and no one in Russia will question it. Or they can say, for example, we have prevented the creation of huge NATO US American military hub in Ukraine. And they say, yeah, no, there is no US American NATO military hub in Kharkiv, and we have been victorious, we have fulfilled our goal. So everything can be proclaimed. If you ask about the real goals, the real outcome of the war, I think that the biggest problem in this war for Ukraine and for the West is that Russia is a tyranny, totalitarian state, and Ukraine is democracy. That's why Russia can tolerate much more the losses than Ukraine can. And Russia can just throw into the fire of war more and more people and just watch how they die. And Ukrainians cannot. Russia also uses the captured territories, the regions of Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson, where they forcibly conscript every male person and just throw them to the front line, where they die mostly. But for Putin, it makes no difference. They are not interesting for Putin. It's okay for him that another 10,000 or 20,000 Ukrainians die in this war. And that is the problem, because Ukrainians are fighting now back endless Russian human waves like grinder meat, cannon fodder that Russians sent to against Ukrainian artillery and machine guns. And for Russians, it means nothing. For Ukrainians, it still means losses. And Ukrainians are out of ammunition. That is a huge problem because, most Ukrainian artillery uses still Soviet-produced ammunition, 152 millimeter ammo, and Ukrainians are out of them. Russians have successfully destroyed several Ukrainian huge ammo depots within the last years, and Russians have also destroyed several similar depots in the EU. Or just remember the explosion on Czech military depot. And I've seen today at New York Times a wonderful article about how Russians try to sabotage deliveries of Soviet standby ammunition for artillery to Ukraine from the West. So currently, Ukraine has 10 times less shots for their artillery compared to Russian per day. So when Russian fires like, let me say, 100 shots, Ukrainians can fire only 10 shots, and that makes a difference. So effectively, to finalize what I'm saying, the biggest problem is that Russia still has way more resources in manpower and in firepower than Ukraine has. And it is actually a tragedy that all the Western weaponry, which was produced during the Cold War with one single purpose, to fight back Soviet army, to fight back Soviet invasion waves, like endless Soviet tank armies, all this equipment just remains silent in Western warehouses, like the Leopard 1 tanks, the Leopard 2 tanks, like artillery units, everything, like helicopters, everything, and doesn't fight in Ukraine where it is needed. So that is still a problem because, like for a good defensive war, history has proved it. You need two things. You need brave army, capable army with enough soldiers, and you need weapons. You cannot fight an enemy only with army. Like Poles in 39 have proven they have perfect soldiers, very brave soldiers, but not enough weaponry, and they could not resist the Soviets and the Nazis. Or you need weapons, but you don't have army. That is also a problem. Like you cannot fight the enemy having weapons but not having army. And we have now weapons, but if Ukrainian army will be destroyed in Ukraine, we will still have enemies, but I'm not sure we will have the army. Because if you compare Bundeswehr with Ukrainian army, I'm not sure that Bundeswehr will fight with the same amount of bravery and creativity and readiness to fight as Ukrainians do it now. So effective would it be to send our weapons, as much weapons we have, to Ukraine and let Ukrainians to finish the story, than to let Ukrainians die now, which is already a crime against humanity, and then face a Russian enemy having all the weapons but not having enough army. Thank you for your kind words. Well, when dealing with Russia, we need to understand that Russian or KGB Putin way of thinking is to weaponize everything, like literally everything. We have seen it in many cases. They weaponize energy delivery, they weaponize food delivery, they weaponize like transport logistics, they weaponize elections, like our own elections, they weaponize them against us. So when you ask me what will they weaponize, like everything what they can, that's so simple. Of course, they use the food crisis to create instability in the most vulnerable regions, and they know that these regions are very close to the European Union. So they know exactly, as during the Syrian conflict and Syrian war and Russian bombardments of civilians in Syria, which what they have done very deliberately, like to create the mass exodus from Syria. They knew that all these people will storm to the EU and will have the overcapacity, the undercapacity of our social services, and the far right parties will celebrate it, and Russians will create a pressure. So when they can create some problem at our home, they create it. Just think about all the campaigns against the vaccination, which were organized by Russians. Why should they have done it? Very simple, out of very simple reason, because they knew that if we have a COVID wave, and then first we will have problem with our hospitals, and we will have like economy problems, but also we will have to introduce a very strict rules for like curfew or masks, etc. People will not be happy. We will have political unrest, etc. So they use the global pandemic to destabilize our societies by introducing the armies of trolls in order to heat this discussion at our home countries. So they will use food crisis. They will use, of course, all sorts of disinformation campaigns. They will try to introduce all sorts of ideas of peacemaking, like let Ukrainians set a compromise. They will work with their influence agents within our political parties who will call for peace negotiations, who will say that this war is useless, that nobody can win a war against Russia, against nuclear power. Like I have heard this idea that nobody can win war against nuclear power so many times. I have already forgotten how Vietnam could win the war, Afghanistan could win the war, way underdeveloped countries compared to Ukraine. Yeah, so they will do everything to destabilize us because their main goal in Ukraine would be to strip Ukraine of the Western support. Because, of course, Ukraine cannot win this war alone. They cannot win war without the Western weaponry and ammunition. So the Russian goal would be to stop or to slow the deliveries of Western equipment and Western ammunition to Ukraine. In this case, the situation in the east will be worse for Ukrainians and Russians will push further. And in this situation, they believe that Zelensky and Ukrainians can accept some sort of compromise. I personally believe that Ukraine will never accept any sort of compromise because they have experienced the trauma of Bucha and trauma of other cities. But it doesn't mean that Putin shares my perception. And I think for him, the only hope is to cut Ukraine off the Western support, and he will try to do it and then enforce some sort of compromise, some sort of Minsk III. His hope that this will mean strategically a defeat for Ukraine, because if this will give him like a pause, a timeout for like 1 year, for example, 2 years, he will be able to collect new forces, to rethink his plans, and to attack Ukraine, which will be even weaker as before. So I think that is his plans. Yeah, thank you.
I don't know if you saw this, sir, but there was a news story, I think a week or week and a half ago, that alludes to the idea that internally within the Biden administration, there's talk about trying to pressure Zelensky to give up some land to Russia because obviously inflation's a very hot political issue, and you can be cynical about incentives here. What's the role of the U.S. here in your opinion? It doesn't seem like sanctions have really done much other than perhaps maybe hurt those that are actually doing the sanctions more than Russia. But talk about that a little bit.
Well, I'm not a big expert in US policy. Like, I would better stay out of the discussing of what and why US has done. I can only say, like, from Ukrainian perspective, the US, of course, remains the most important supporter of Ukraine. If you look at the amount of weapons and equipment sent from the US to Ukraine, it's astonishing. Like, it is the number one supporter of Ukraine. But you still can see that this weapon is not enough. This weapon is the deliveries only reach the level to maintain some sort of status quo, but they're not enough to decisively win the battlefield and to start a massive counteroffensive. Like the artillery, the amount of artilleries and the quality of the missiles. Like, correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I understand, the missiles for multi-launch rocket systems delivered from the US only reach for 80 kilometers and not like 200 or 300 kilometers, which is a difference. Or, for example, the US doesn't send any jets. The US doesn't send attack helicopters. It only sends Soviet-style transport helicopters, Mil-17. The US doesn't send, as far as I understand, the air defense systems like Patriot. So the weapons which could be the game changers are even not being sent, like jets, attack helicopters, anti-air systems, or being sent in very small amounts, like multiply launch rocket systems. And that is, of course, important, especially now when, like, Vladimir Putin has already digested his first defeat. If you remember how Vladimir Putin looked like amid his Victory Day parade on the 9th of May in Moscow, he looked like a devastated man. He looked like Adolf Hitler on 20th April of 1945. Completely devastated, old bald man hiding himself under cover on the Red Square. And if you look at him 1.5 months later, 2 weeks ago, amid his meeting with the students at St. Petersburg, when he was like shining and in his very comfortable role of creator of historical mythology, telling stories about Russian Emperor Peter I, who has conquered, or not conquered, returned, of course, Russian lands. And when Putin named Estonian city of Narva as a Russian city which deserves to be returned, like, he was back in his element. And why? What has happened? Why did this happen? Because back to May 9th, Putin believed that the West will deliver to Ukraine all the weapons Ukraine needs, and he cannot fight it back. And now he sees that deliveries are very limited, and he has already found and tapped to another resource sources like the forcibly conscript males from occupied Ukrainian territories. And he says, okay, I have lost 35,000 males. It's not very comfortable, but out of these 35,000 males, maybe 10,000 are Ukrainian forcibly conscripts. I don't care about Ukrainians. And out of the rest, like 25,000, the half are national minorities, like from Buryatia, from Kalmykia, from Bashkortostan. It's even good for me, he says, because these ethnical regions, they had separatist tendencies and they had male overpopulation. Now I have burned the young males from these ethnic regions in Ukraine. So I have weakened effectively the governors of these regions. They cannot rebel against me. So it's win-win-win situation. And the war is continuing on Ukrainian territory. Like every day, Ukrainians bombard Russian troops staying on Ukrainian territory. Ukrainians destroy their own land. They bombard like some farms where Russians hide their tanks. Yes, they destroy Russian tanks, but they destroy Ukrainian farms. They shell Ukrainian fields with Russian infantry. Yes, they kill Russian infantry, but they send UXOs, unexploded ordnances, like in every like 100 shells, like one doesn't explode, maybe five doesn't explode. So they infest own lands, own agricultural lands with unexploded ordnances. They effectively ruin their own country. And for Vladimir Putin, it's absolutely okay because no shell explodes on Russian territory. And it has been said explicitly by the Western governments, don't use our artillery against Russian territory. Don't shoot towards Russian troops on Russian territory. So Russians still can hold like some battalion attack groups, battalion tactical groups in Belgorod or Kursk region, just across the border of Ukraine, threatening Kharkiv, which is located only 40 kilometers from the border. And Ukrainians may not even shell them because the West has forbidden. So for Putin, the long war, the long fight is not that bad. Okay, we cannot say what is happening in Russian economy and how dramatic are the decline and like the unemployment, etc. for Russian economy. I think it's bad enough. But the question is how long can they hold it? And I repeat, an autocracy, a tyranny, has always longer breath than a democracy. Thank you.
All right, one last question. Everybody that's here, make sure you follow Sergej and check out his fantastic tweets. The way he kind of frames things, I think, is worth a follow on Twitter. Let's go to the final question, and we'll wrap up.
Well, as I told already, I don't believe that Vladimir Putin is interested in any dialogue or compromise, except of the process of the dialogue which he can use to strengthen his position in order to attack you like 2 days later from the stronger position. He already has understood like how gas prices like he delivers us less gas, but he gets more money because like the price is skyrocketed. And yes, he can leave amid this situation because he still gets like his income and other sanctions. Like okay, like today Russia could not fulfill its debt obligations and because they could not pay back debts. Send rubles, the rubles will not be accepted. So technically Russia has defaulted. Will it change something like for his gas export? I don't believe so. So yes, on the long run, Russian economy is ruined. But the question is, will Kiev fall before Russian economy is ruined? That's a question. Or to say it in other words, how many Ukrainian young male and women will die before Russian economy is ruined? And do we have this time? Do Ukrainians have this time? The peace talks, well, like ideal situation, ideal outcome for Putin would be, for example, now to freeze the current fighting line and to oblige Ukraine with some sort of like no fire obligations. Then Russians will have free hands. They will integrate the regions. They will use the resources they have captured. They will continue to blockade Russian harbors. to make Russia, to make Ukraine, to blockade Ukrainian harbors, to make Ukrainian exports impossible, at least via the sea. They will continue to brainwash the population, to kidnap children, like install their proxies there, and to prepare the next attack on Ukraine, because they will not relax until they conquer Mykolaiv and Odessa, and until they threaten Poland and other NATO countries. They will, of course, try to replay the attack on Poland and Lithuania using waves of refugees. Or I would not call them refugees. They're not, to use the waves of like young male transported deliberately with the jets from Middle East to Belarusian border. And they will do all the stuff of things they used to do. They will try to influence our elections. They will try to finance our radical parties. They will go further in their playbook. That is essential. That you have asked me before, like not you, Vlad, but another participant, about like what is the mistakes of the West. The mistake of the West is to believe, as I said, that Vladimir Putin is looking for a compromise, and that you don't need to escalate, that you can provoke Vladimir Putin with some sort of aggressive actions. No, you cannot. Because Vladimir Putin is a person who has already decided to start world war. He is already in his World War mood. His plans are clear: to destroy Ukraine, to destroy Baltic states, to undermine NATO, and in the best scenario, to get political control over Germany. I don't say the occupation of Germany, but to have political control over Germany, to dictate our political agenda, to have control over 1-2 parliamentary parties in Germany. That are his goals, and he's on his way. So if we try to de-escalate in every conflict with Russia, we just give Putin more maneuver. And we know that the only thing which stops Vladimir Putin is a violent response. So Turkey has demonstrated it as Russia invaded Russian planes, invaded Turkish airspace from Syria. The Turks have shot down 2 Russian planes, and nothing has happened. Like, just think about it. Turkey has shot down 2 Russian planes, 2 Russian pilots have been killed, and Russia didn't bombard Turkey, of course didn't nuke Turkey, didn't impose sanctions on Turkey, except of like some sanctions on Turkish vegetables, which have been lifted later because Russia has realized they cannot live without them. So if now, let me say, Estonia or Latvia or Poland would have shot down a couple of Russian jets or helicopters which invade their airspace, many politicians in Germany would say, oh no, this will lead to nuclear World War III. No, it will not. It will lead to nothing, and more, it will prevent further Russian aggressive steps, because that is the only way that Russia understands. As Vladimir Lenin said about essence of Soviet politics towards the West: test it with a bayonet. If you find mesh, proceed. If you find steel, retreat. That is what Putin does. He tests us with bayonet. And when we try to find compromise, he says, okay, it's mesh. I proceed until I find for steel, until I meet steel. And he has met steel in Ukraine. And that's why he tries now to introduce some peace talks, because he knows that blunt force stops him and peace talks just give him more strength. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that's a good analogy. So listen, everybody, we're a little bit over here. I appreciate those that joined and stayed. Sergej, first time you and I speak, definitely appreciate your knowledge and expertise for a different type of topic for these kind of spaces that I do daily. We'll try and do maybe a follow-up in a few months. But everybody, thank you again, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, Sergej. Appreciate it.